Welcome to Earth, a love story. I'm your host, Robin Lassiter. This is a solo episode where I talk about the thing that still makes me sweat and cringe and flush hot and cold and feel like a panicky teenager all over again. Namely, romantic love and the sex that comes with it. Relationships. I'm doing this episode as a kind of raw nerve exposure therapy. Shadow work, baby. You know I love it. I love shadow work like I love grief work, meaning after the fact and in theory. It's all fun and games until it touches some wounded and tender part, and then I'm reminded of what it's really like to be in the underworld. What it really means to look at the thing that everything in my psyche is working really hard not to look at. That's the shadow after all. The stuff we not only don't want to see, but really can't fully see. The things below the surface. And when we peek over the edge, we can get an intense, funny feeling that we definitely should not be looking. We definitely should not dive into those depths. Not only will it be uncomfortable, the mind screams, but it might actually annihilate us. The body resists, too. I get nauseous, sleepy. Sometimes after a dark dream full of shadow material, I wake up with pain flushing through my limbs. I've come to think of this pain as a kind of purging, but who knows? Either way, my whole system is sure that diving into the deep underworlds will kill me. And spoiler, it will. Or at least some aspects of me. Part of us dies every time we cross a threshold, every time we venture through an event horizon. Thankfully, there's a birth that accompanies every death, and so every threshold crossing is also death practice. We learn to die and not die. We learn that death is safe. But it's still a fucking death. So it's hard. It's a big deal. Why on earth would anyone go there on purpose? Inanna did, by the way. Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Earth, she went on purpose. She wasn't dragged into the underworld like Persephone. And no shade, Persephone. We've all been dragged and will get dragged again. But yeah, Inanna went on purpose. But even she just went down to watch. She wasn't going down to actually die. She just wanted a peek. She wanted, as she told the gatekeeper, to witness the funeral rites. Bad news, Inanna. No one gets out that easy. Why am I going down? Why am I leaning into this particular discomfort? And why, for the love of God, am I doing it publicly? Because the only way out is through, and creation never stops moving and changing and evolving. And when I cling, I get stuck and static and rigid and inflexible, and everything slows down to a crawl until I deal with the thing. Right now, looking at my shadow around relationship and sex is the thing. And I'm doing it publicly simply for the accountability. Simply because I'm super uncomfortable doing it publicly. So, just to catch you up, about 6 years ago I met Jupiter. And if you've listened to me read my book in the first 15 episodes of this podcast, or if you read my book yourself, you know a little bit about Jupiter. He was a breath of fresh air and kindness and hope after a long, dark journey into the depths of addiction and depression, unsafe relationships and codependency. And I pinned a lot onto that relationship. I hadn't yet touched bottom, hadn't been broken open by grief, and so I still had it in my head that something or someone would come along and rescue me from life. And I was really hoping it would be him. The story is predictable. For a while it was wonderful, and 4 years later it wasn't. Our dynamic became more toxic as I desperately clung to a sinking ship, and he desperately tried to muster the courage and tenacity to break up with me. Years earlier, I'd read The Hero with 1,000 Faces by Joseph Campbell and discovered a sort of forgotten part of the hero's journey, which is what happens when we don't answer the call. You know, the call that we all eventually get that beckons us into the underworld. The call that could be a loss or a tragedy or illness, or maybe it's a call from our golden selves, asking us to change some foundational thing in life so we can go be who our soul wants us to be. We get a call. And everyone, so much so that it's acknowledged as a vital part of the journey, everyone refuses. And you guys know all about that, refusing the call. I'm thinking of Neo on the ledge and Morpheus coaching him to evade the agents, and Neo finally refusing and giving himself up. It's part of the journey. And there's another part of the journey that doesn't get talked about much, and that's what happens when we keep refusing the call. When we keep refusing the call, we become the villain in someone else's story. And I know that. I know that's what happens. I've done it in other relationships. I've put so much weight on relationships and have been so terrified of them ending that many times I clung even after the thing was long dead, like some sort of dark necrophilia. The call for me was, and ever is, to let go. I refused and refused until I finally became the villain. And therefore, when you become the villain, you become a character in someone else's story. I became the thing Jupiter needed to overcome. I became a side character, a threshold guardian in his hero's journey. And I'll tell you what, nothing sucks the life force out of my body faster than becoming a side character. And spoiler, he finally said yes to his call and broke up with me. Suddenly I was back in my own story. And someday I'll tell you about the last death of the small self that resulted from that tremendous grief. It was a massive turning point in my life, but for now we're talking about love and sex and relationships. Believe me, I would much rather talk about death. Romantic love, for me, is fraught. Have you caught that yet? I probably qualify for SLA. And if you don't know what SLA is, lucky you. Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. I never went to a meeting because I'm pretty sure I'd meet my next Prince Charming there. And sex to some extent, but mostly love, is, to me, like a drug. With love, my addict tendencies flare, and the chemical cascade that is unleashed is better than booze, better than cigarettes, better than pills. Maybe heroin comes close. I accidentally did heroin once, and it was the best feeling I've ever had, and I wanted to feel like that every day for the rest of my life. But fortunately, I didn't know where to get it, and I exited that guy who introduced me to it from my life soon after. And how one accidentally does heroin is also another story for another episode. I digress. The end of the relationship with Jupiter brought me through the gateway of grief that leads to relief. I died and didn't die. It was horrible and beautiful, and it is still my most potent touchstone when I need to feel the anguish of a non-negotiable no. And therefore touch something foundational about being alive. That being that everything will die. It all passes, all of it. And believe me, I know that. And yet, I still cling. And it's taken me a while to stabilize. Jupiter and I left on good terms. I still wish him the best. I'm actually very grateful for the roles that we played in each other's lives, and I can say that about all of my relationships. I'm grateful for them. I know we were doing soul work together, even if it looked really messy and painful. I've stabilized now, and I've never had more peace, more joy, more freedom, more beautiful and deep relationships with friends and family and myself and the land. I've never felt more loved and more solidly situated in the big we of this web of goodness. Good people, good nature, good land, good healthy body and boundaries and soul work at the center. It's good. And yet, even though I feel whole and happy, I am finding myself more and more starved for touch. It's not enough to touch myself, divinals. It's not enough to hold myself. My psyche and mind and heart are so wonderfully held in a collective of the best people. And my body is longing to be held as well. And that's the part that's mostly in the shadow. What is the hardest thing for me to admit? That I want love. I want touch and sex and physical and emotional intimacy. And even harder to admit, I think I'd like a partner. I think I'd like someone to partner up with and have a life together. But now wait a minute. You guys have heard of a thing called a split ego state, right? Where one part wants one thing and another part wants another thing. That's one reason I'm doing this episode, to talk it all out and maybe figure out what the fuck it is I actually want. Do I want a partner? Someone to live with me like all the time? In the past, I've given up a lot of myself to take care of my partners. They didn't even ask me to. I just did it. And of course, used that against them later in classic codependent fashion. I put all of my time and energy and life force into my partner's life over and over again, and eventually I became a hollow, bitter, exhausted shell of a person who was just a raw nerve of unmet needs. So maybe I don't want a partner. Maybe I want a lover. Someone to keep the old rites with me on the full and new moons and solstices and equinoxes, and then they go home. And we like each other, and there's something real and sacred happening, but that's it. I have to admit, that sounds really nice. And so, step 1, figure out what the fuck I want. And in order to do that, I think I have to figure out what I believe about relationships. And for some context here, I know that our constructs, our belief systems, and the actions that emerge from those belief systems, conscious or unconscious, are not carved in stone. They are actually sky flowers. And I have quite a bit of experience loosening the grips of an unhelpful construct that has worn out its welcome, going through the deconstruction and dissolution process and creating a new, more helpful construct. So I know it's possible to do this with relationships too, because my ideas and beliefs around relationships are, regardless of how shadowy and stuck and intrinsic they feel, ultimately just a construct. And I've already started this process actually, although I abandoned getting to the core of it, going fully and completely into the deconstruction, into the dissolution, touching bottom, as I call it, because Jupiter came along. Why should I? He was going to save the day, and I could finally rest and never have to think about anything ever again. But back before Jupiter arrived, I was diving deep into the history of relationships as we know them. Does marriage forever and happily ever after actually work? Is that the norm and everything else is a failed version of that? Is that really true? I started looking around and saw very quickly that that is not true. I read Aziz Ansari's book Modern Romance, which makes a pretty good argument for love being about proximity and convenience, and many of the women in the little old couples who'd spent 60 years in a seemingly functional marriage talked about how they wish they would have had more of their own life. And I read The Ethical Slut by Janet Hardy and Dossie Easton. I read Sex at Dawn by Christopher Ryan and Casilda Jetha, which is about bonobo monkeys, whose species is best characterized as female-centered and egalitarian, and how we're genetically as close to them as we are to chimpanzees, and how they've swapped aggression for sex, and so they hang out and have sex and masturbate each other all day, in a variety of groups that transcend gender and pair bonds. Which really, honestly, is a lot of work to come to the conclusion that we should just get to fuck as many people as we want. And I know I'm oversimplifying. Don't get mad at me, poly people. I know it's not just that by a long shot. But when it arrives to us as a watered-down version, that's exactly what it feels like. And I have to say, it was compelling. And this was part of the deconstruction phase, and ethical non-monogamy and polyamory ideas were just entering the mainstream, and it was so enticing to think that this was the answer. This is why relationships hadn't worked for me. Because lifelong monogamy wasn't really the norm, as I'd been taught. And all the things I'd internalized about wanting sex and love and connection being wrong if it wasn't inside a long-term monogamous relationship started to see the light of day. What we need to remember, though, is that while this was going on, I was first deep in alcoholism and then white-knuckling sobriety for a year or so as I was exploring all of this. I had just ended an unsafe relationship, and I was trying to lock something down with a new guy who would never, ever be locked down. My nervous system was shot. My attachment system was raging, anxious, and I mean raging. I was in a several years long uninterrupted fight or flight trauma response. What a great time to try ethical non-monogamy. And the thought systems that arose around that time were really great and even very sophisticated. And I think sound. like compersion, to take a small example. Compersion is vicarious joy associated with seeing one's partner have a joyful romantic or sexual relation with another. Like, I'm going to be happy for you because you're happy. And if I'm completely secure and fulfilled and not coming from a space of lack, I can be happy for your happiness. That sounded so great to me because part of me didn't want to limit myself either. I wanted a big old love fest where we were all just happy for each other's happiness. Great. Sign me up. In practice, I was a wreck, and watching my partner being happy with someone else was fucking gutting. Plus, I am such an open, sensitive person, and I often work in multiple dimensions. So, as this was happening, I would dream about my partner's partner and spend entire nights working through their trauma and wake up pissed. Needless to say, none of this worked out. At that time, I internalized that failure as something else that was just intrinsically wrong with me. I can't even non-monogamy right. I can't do any of it right. And now, after lots of therapy and stability, and now that my nervous system has learned what safety actually feels like, and now that I have a peace that I never want to give up, I realize that I'm just not built for that. Probably I'm not built for that. Through that disillusion and deconstruction process, I left behind what was not working for me, and I did adopt some new belief systems that are still with me today. First of all, the idea I'd had in my head that relationship was about meeting each other's needs at the expense of our own no longer rang true. For example, I have a habit of choosing men who really value freedom and feel trapped by the ideas of commitment. And guess what? I really value freedom too. And I also really value stability and consistency, and I'm somewhat traditional in that way. I basically just want to know that we're solid. And because I can be anxiously attached in certain relationships, I probably want to know that pretty often, especially at first. And the partners who I chose not only valued freedom, but were often on the avoidance side. So my wanting to know pretty often that we were okay made them feel like jumping out of a moving vehicle. And them feeling like jumping out of a moving vehicle to get away from me made me feel anxious. You can see the problem. And also, I should just say I'm a fucking Cancer sun, and my Venus is in Cancer as well. I know. That's actually probably all I need to say for this entire episode, and you'll all go, oh, yeah, shit. I get it. Tough break, Robin. Good luck out there. Anyway, all this is just stuff I learned over time. Bottom line is I was picking people who naturally wouldn't be able to fulfill my needs. And I now understand that if you like dogs, for example, you should get a dog. If you really like dogs, you shouldn't get a cat and then try to get them to change into a dog to meet your needs. You should just go find a dog. Because when I'm with a person who's not avoidant, my nervous system begins to take note of the safety and the fact that he's not scrambling for the door handle to make a getaway, tucking and rolling onto some backcountry dirt road and out of my life. And then I need to check in about how solid we are a lot less often. Also, and this is a big one, I learned that all of the qualities, good and bad, that I was projecting onto my partner were actually my own. That one was fun. I loved him because he was fun and free and wild, or because he didn't give a fuck, and I was wound so tight and gave all the fucks, but secretly really wanted to be like him. Or I was so mad at him because he was being too wild, drinking and partying and not taking care of himself, and the truth was I was doing exactly the same. I was looking at mirrors of myself over and over again. In my recent interview with Daniel Rexon, who wrote Missing Time Found, and by the way, has just finished his next book about the geometry of body marks, and he'll be back on the podcast soon. He said something like, if we don't address our shadow material, it plays out in our lives in really damaging ways. And I believe that. I believe it because I lived it. I was completely unaware of any shadow material and was constantly seeking outside of myself for wholeness. Unconsciously, of course, but there it is. I eventually learned that the union I was so desperately seeking was within, and that before I can be in a healthy relationship, I needed to be a whole person. I needed to be able to hold myself and my nervous system. Then I can be in an actual relationship with another. First, safe for myself, then safe for the room, then safe for the world. And on that note, another thing I've come to believe, and I use this one with my clients and myself often, is that if I'm saying something like, he never listens to me, or they don't take me seriously, or she thinks I'm lazy because I need so much downtime, if I catch myself saying things like that, I invite myself to reframe and say, am I listening to me? Am I taking myself seriously? Do I believe there's something wrong with me taking so much downtime? And there's a time and place to ask questions like that for sure. I mean, not in the middle of a verbally or physically or emotionally abusive relationship, for example. But when the time is right, when enough strength and stability and kind of metacognition about the situation has arrived, questions like that can really help redirect us back into our own authority and responsibility. And that's what I've learned more than anything through all of this. My life, my happiness, all of it is an inside job. My relationships have given me so much motivation to try to be and do better, so much friction, so much need for therapy, and self-education on attachment styles and somatic work and nervous system repair. I mean, relationships and the dysfunction therein are directly responsible for my career. I know how to hold space for a somatic release because I learned to hold space for myself. I know how to guide someone to orient towards a more mature, loving, wise version of themselves because I oriented to that part of myself. I had to learn how to love my wounded maiden back to wholeness so she would stop blowing shit up and burning shit down and running away in the night. She did that a lot, by the way, for a lot of years. So what I'm talking about is something called inner reparenting. But let's take this opportunity to de-psychologize all of this. There's nothing wrong with psychology, and therapy has been incredibly helpful for me, but it often centers the individual as the problem. Like, if you can just get your shit together, everything will be fine. But I was so beaten down, and eventually talking about all the things that were wrong with me wasn't helping. What ultimately began to be more helpful was myth, storytelling, and placing myself in an ecosystem. I needed to tell myself a better story about myself. I remember talking to my therapist when I lived in Hawaii, and I asked him one day, can I just tell myself a new story about it all? Can I claim the narrative and choose to be empowered by this instead of victimized? And he sighed and leaned back in his chair and put his hands into his wild pirate hair and said, yes, that's what I spend every day trying to teach every single one of my clients. And at that time, I was still spiritually bypassing quite a bit, so it didn't land as deeply as it could. But I did start telling myself a new story about myself. And this is the beginning of the creation stage after the destruction and disillusion stage. I put myself and my life into context. I began to look at why I'd acted the way I'd acted, why I'd been with the men I'd been with, and in the dramatic and unsafe relationships I'd been in. I saw an incredibly sensitive child incarnated into a freaking Wild West shit show. And imagine if my childhood had been horrible. This place, Samsara in particular, is a Wild West shit show even under the best of circumstances. So of course I learned to armor up. I learned to fight. I learned to numb and run. My young self grew up fast, trying to put systems in place to keep me safe. I mean, remember the 90s? Remember what consent was like in the 90s? And if you're saying, yeah, consent wasn't a thing in the 90s, bingo. So I did the hard work of connecting in with a big, wise, unconditionally loving and accepting aspect of myself. And I began to hold this sensitive child and heal her and let her tell her stories and let her rest. And I began to try to meet her needs. I invited her to put down her armor and sword. And it was really funny. I was doing a meditation one day, going down and in to my own soft belly to listen to her and meet with her and invite her to rest and soften. And I saw her standing up against the wall. She was about 14, and she was dressed sort of like Katniss Everdeen, with a shield across her chest and calf-high boots and a sword at her hip. And she was like, go fuck yourself. I don't trust you for 1 second. And the only reason we survived is because I fought. and blew up and burned my way out of the tangled messes we got into, and I am not putting down my sword. And I gotta say, I kind of love her for that. I love her still for that. And it took about 6 months of coming to her with full acceptance of however she presented, until one day she laid down the shield and sword, and she inhabited me fully, and we climbed into bed and curled into a ball, and sobbed until every last tear was shed for every last fuckery done. And I held her and cried with her and showered her with unconditional love, and now she trusts me, and she's living her best life doing all the things a kid should do, like laughing and playing and creating and learning, instead of always standing stoic at the ready. Okay, I'm going to need to wrap this up. I feel like I could talk about all of this for ages, and honestly, I have not even scratched the surface. I still don't know exactly what I really want. This is how much there is tied up in relationship stuff for me. I think this is going to be episode 1 of, many. I'm sure I'll revisit this topic more and more as I continue to on purpose lean into my shadow. For now, though, I'll end it with where I've landed with all this so far. And that is that I've done a tremendous amount of healing. I've gathered a tremendous amount of tools. I know how to hold myself and how to regulate my nervous system. And if I decide to come into romantic relationship again, certainly this time with a dog instead of a cat, I will only be with someone who can hold space for all of this complexity, someone who thinks I'm worth it. Do I hold space for all of this complexity? I instantly reframe. Do I think I'm worth it? Yes. Yes, I do. One big unanswered question remains, though. Say I find that guy who can hold space for all of the complexity and thinks I'm worth it, who is a dog and not a cat, who thinks me living in an off-grid dome in the middle of nowhere is fucking cool. Tell me this. When do I tell him about the aliens? Thank you to my patrons who support this podcast for very little in return, I must say. I am not great at putting stuff on Patreon, but I'm going to get better, I promise. And thank you to Morgan Jenks for our musical soundscapes. And thank you to you, dear listener. If you would like more information or to book a one-on-one session with me, please visit honeyheart.org.